Hello, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for putting together such a wonderfully diverse conference on a topic that's always extremely important, but all the more so in the times that we're in. So my paper is an effort to understand female paid and unpaid work in India. And it's set in the context of a declining female labor force participation rate in India since the late 1980s. This has been raised as a puzzle in the literature because the declining rate is in spite of the rapid economic growth in the economy. So if you look at the graph, you'll find that in 1993-94, around half of the rural females were in the labor force. And this declined to around 25% in 2017-18. And the rate for urban areas has been roughly stagnant. There have been several explanations that have been advanced to explain the puzzle. One of that is that younger females have been increasingly enrolling in higher education and therefore they're not participating in the labor force. And that does explain part of it, but not entirely. Another explanation that's been used quite often is that households have experienced rising real incomes, and so women voluntarily withdraw from the paid workforce. Now, this doesn't resonate very well with the evidence that there's been a declining rate even among the poorest household quintiles. There's also an explanation that's been advanced that even though there's been high rates of economic growth, the nature of that growth process has been such that sufficient employment opportunities have not been generated. So I start from this line that more complex factors are at work than are usually discussed. And the explanation that I look towards is that that declining rate in the female labor force participation rate has been matched by a corresponding rise in females engaged in social reproductive labor. And here, when I say social reproductive labor, that's referring to certain categories that employment surveys tend to capture, which is the activity of attending to domestic duties, like caring for household members, cooking and cleaning, but also being engaged in free collection of goods like vegetables or roots, firewood, cattle feed, also sewing, tailoring, and weaving for own household use, which are not included in the definition of work as per these employment surveys, which also, of course, has broader implications for how society would think of such work. And this we can see much more clearly if we look at the recent Time Use survey, which after long-drawn efforts by feminist academics was conducted in 2019, which points strikingly towards the gendered use of time. So if we look at these categories of activities, paid employment and unpaid domestic and caregiving services for household members, what we find is in terms of the proportions that are engaged in these activities in the working age group, around 70% of the males in rural and urban areas were engaged in paid employment as compared to around 20% of the females. Whereas if you look at the unpaid domestic and caregiving services, and of course there would be quite a bit of overlap between all of these activities, you would find that only around 31% of rural males and 24% of urban males were engaged in unpaid domestic services, as compared to 94% of rural females and 89% of urban females. And similarly, if we look at unpaid caregiving services, what we find is that the proportion of females who were engaged in such activities was actually double that of the males who were engaged in unpaid caregiving services in both rural and urban areas. And this also reflects in the proportion of time that's spent during the day on various activities. So if we look at the amount of time that is spent on self-care and maintenance, which comes at the bottom of these columns, and at the top, if you look at all other activities, which would include learning, socializing, leisure activities, all of those put together, both the top and the bottom are roughly similar for males and females. Where the difference comes is in terms of the proportion of time that they spend on paid employment and on unpaid domestic and caregiving services. And of course, this has a link with the proportion of males and females who are actually engaged in paid employment in the first place. Right? And so we can find that 17% of the time that rural males had during the day was spent on engaging in paid employment, and 21% of the time of urban males was in paid employment. Whereas for rural females, and for urban females as well, in fact, around 20% of their time, so around 1/5 of their day, went towards unpaid domestic and caregiving services. So more than 4 hours during a day towards unpaid domestic and caregiving services, whereas only around 2 to 3% of the time of males went towards such activities. And this tells us quite a bit in terms of the amount of or the extent of labor that females put in towards such activities, in spite of which it is not counted as work. And the declining female labor force participation rate and the corresponding rise in the participation in social reproductive labor needs to be seen alongside a larger withdrawal of the state from providing basic services, most notably in terms of a shift towards providing health insurance, so a move away from being responsible for the health of one's citizens. And we can actually see this through the accounts of declining access to common property resources. So, for instance, this reference is for the state of Andhra Pradesh, which points to a nexus between the state and large capital in acquiring land to use it for setting up private enterprises. And this actually has has larger implications for the extent of time and effort that household members then have to spend in collecting free goods that they earlier used to get from these common property resources, such as water and firewood. And usually the responsibility for getting such free goods tends to fall on the female household members. Also, in this account by Sainath for the state of Maharashtra, he points to advertisements of apartments where each apartment has its own private swimming pool in a state which regularly has droughts and where thousands of villagers depend on visits from water tankers, which may only pass by the village once a week. And he speaks of how several of the workers who are actually building those apartments belong to those villages which don't have regular access to water. And these are accounts from certain regions, but this is also borne out by the national level data, which tells us that 67% of the total population did not have access to piped water in 2018. Now, water insecurity is, of course, itself a big problem, but it doesn't fall equally. The effect of that doesn't fall equally on all household members. There are gendered impacts of that. And as Krishnaraj puts it, the conversion of drinking water into a private good where the market plays an important role adversely affects women. And from ethnographic accounts, we know that in certain regions, women may spend anywhere between 2 and 6 hours in a day traveling long distances and collecting water for use in their household. This again is borne out by the national level data, which suggests that in 76% of the rural households and 50% of those of the urban households where water was not available within the premises, it was a female household member who had to fetch water. So to summarize, the decline in the female labor force participation rate needs to be understood with the corresponding rise in reproductive labor. And this points towards a need to redefine work, both at the level of statistical collection, but also in terms of the larger implications for how such work is considered. There also needs to be a recognition of the gendered use of time and how that in fact supports the survival of not just the household, but also the workforce and the society at large. And all of this needs to be placed and seen in the context of a larger withdrawal of the state from providing basic services, which has been brought home to us all the more sharply in recent times. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kankan. My presentation today is about the division of childcare labor in urban Chinese families. Currently, in urban China, grandparents are widely involved in the care of young children alongside their parents, which is partly due to the high employment rate of mothers, short parental leave, and a lack of formal childcare facilities. There has been a large body of literature on the gender division of domestic labor and childcare. However, most of them focus on nuclear families, while the situations in extended families is largely unknown. So, my study examines how childcare labor is divided between parents and grandparents in extended families in urban China, and how does grandparents' involvement challenge or reinforce the gender division of childcare labor between parents. I adopt a broad definition of childcare labor, which includes housework such as laundry and cooking that are key to the well-being of the children, as well as the more direct caring tasks such as feeding, bathing, playing, or teaching the children. In addition, my study also includes the less tangible tasks such as emotional labor and cognitive labor. So this is a qualitative study, which is mainly based on interviews with matched pairs of parents and grandparents from 46 families in the city of Guangzhou. I use purposeful sampling to recruit middle-class families where both parents are in full-time employment and at least one grandparent is involved in the care of a child under the age of 3. Here are some of my main findings. The interviews suggest that childcare provision in my respondents' family is like a group project, where parents and grandparents work together closely on a daily basis. However, within this group project, the joint carers from the same family are positioned hierarchically. In particular, I find that grandparents are in a relatively disadvantaged position compared with parents, and that even with the support from grandparents, the division of childcare between parents continues to be highly unequal. So the rest of my presentation will look at these 2 points in greater details. First, grandparents' disadvantaged position is reflected in 2 aspects. First of all, they tend to spend more time on childcare than parents. So in all the families of my participants, the parents and grandparents, they either live together or within very short distance. So on a typical weekday, after both parents leave for work, their children are entirely under the care of the grandparents, who at the same time are also responsible for housework. After their first shift of childcare during the day, which is already 10 hours typically, it is not unusual for grandparents to continue to be involved in the evenings and weekends due to their living arrangements. In some cases, this is because parents have additional work commitments. For example, in this case, the mother is the head counselor of her college and needs to keep her phone on all the time. And the father is a police officer who's regularly on duty at night. So their daughter is looked after by the maternal grandparents. And according to the grandmother here, because her daughter often arrives home late and has phone calls coming from work in the evening, they as the grandparents have to take care of everything for their granddaughter so that the mother can focus on her work undisturbed. In other cases, parents do not have work to do, but housework is again taken care of by grandparents, simply because the older generation do not want to burden their adult children after their day of work. So for example, in this case, if the mother tries to clean the table after dinner, the grandfather would stop her and tell her, "You need to get some rest." Either way, grandparents in my study are prioritizing the needs of the younger generation, be it their professional needs or their recreational needs. However, we should not forget that grandparents are also doing a long shift of care work, which is often unpaid and extends into late nights and weekends. The second aspect of grandparents' disadvantaged position is reflected by the types of work they are responsible for. So for parents, they take on certain childcare tasks based on 2 considerations. First, they seek to enhance the bond between themselves and their children. Therefore, in the evenings and weekends, as indicated by Grandma Liu here, grandparents would purposely fade into the background by taking up domestic chores so that parents can spend more time talking and playing with their children, giving them a bath and putting them into bed, which all involve intimate contacts with their children. Parents also seek to provide the necessary stimulation for their children's development, which according to them requires certain know-how or cultural capital, which grandparents do not necessarily possess. So roughly half of the grandparents in my study come from rural areas and have very limited education, which means it is hard for them to read to their grandchildren, to teach them, or to keep up with the latest expert advice on childcare. However, even the relatively better educated grandparents can still be considered as less qualified due to their lack of certain specialized childcare knowledge. For example, this mother, she has a background in psychology, so she would choose toys for her daughters carefully according to her development stages, with an aim to cultivate certain skills and abilities. However, because the grandparents do not have such professional knowledge in psychology, according to the mother, they can only play with her daughter for fun. As a result, parents in my study tend to reserve these so-called intellectually demanding tasks for themselves, leaving the more basic ones, such as cleaning or cooking, to the grandparents. This creates a hierarchy between tasks that are basic and advanced, physical and intellectual, which would risk devaluing the contributions made by grandparents. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the boundary between what parents and grandparents can do is less defined in families where grandparents are of higher socio-economic backgrounds. Still, taken together, the result is that grandparents are more likely to undertake tasks that are considered to be more laborious and less enjoyable. Moving on to the parents, my findings suggest that even with the significant support from grandparents, the way how childcare labor is divided between mothers and fathers is still highly unequal, which is reflected in two ways. First, mothers are more likely to supplement grandparental care with their own childcare labor or by arranging additional help. This is because mothers are more likely to be aware of the limitations of grandparental care, or they would feel obliged to ease the burden of the older generation because of the norm of filial piety. Mothers' more pronounced role is reflected in their involvement in the daily care and in other less tangible aspects such as collecting childcare information, making childcare decisions, and coordinating different forms of care. Due to time constraints, here I only include a few examples. So in terms of collecting childcare information, a major source is from online chat groups consisting of local mothers. Every mother I interviewed belonged to at least 5 of such groups, where they talked about everything related to their children's life. During my fieldwork, I repeatedly asked if there's such a thing as father's group, and the answers I get is either a straight no or laughter because of the absurdity of the idea. One father told me this experience, that he was once in the father's chat group, but that group quickly became silent, and if anyone ever speaks, it's about video games. So father's group do not talk about children. Because mothers spend so much time and energy on gathering information from other fellow mothers and childcare experts, fathers often regard their wives as all-knowing and therefore rely on them for instructions and for decision-making. For example, this father says that it is my wife who gives me the order and I just carry it out. And according to this mother, because her husband can never match the amount of information she has, he simply gives up and let her take full charge of the decisions regarding childcare. Another dimension of the inequality between parents is that mothers tend to be responsible for the emotional labor in order to maintain a harmonious intergenerational relationship with the grandparents. Mothers tend to feel uneasy about the level of burden they exert on the older generation, and as a result, they actively seek to express their gratitude by making monetary repayment, sending grandparents gifts, arranging celebrations of their birthdays, or traveling, and in their daily interaction give them compliments. Although such care is aimed at grandparents, since it is crucial for the normal operation of the intergenerational childcare, I also count it as part of mother's childcare labor. To summarize, existing studies in the West have noticed that when middle-class families are faced with work-life conflicts, instead of the husbands increasing their domestic involvement, such responsibilities are more commonly pushed down to paid domestic helpers. In my study, it is the grandparents who serve as the shock absorbers, and most of them are doing it for free. In these families, childcare labor is shared unevenly among the family members. When the gender-based inequality is partially replaced by a generational-based inequality with grandparents' involvement, the division of childcare between mothers and fathers continues to be highly unequal. That's all from me for now. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your feedback and questions.